Hello there and welcome back. Now, we've had such a fabulous lineup of speakers today, and in this final session I'm very delighted and indeed very honoured to be able to bring to you the Global Policy Advisor for UN Women. She is a lady who is with UN Women, leading the organisation's work on gender budgeting and financing for gender equality. In her role, she provides technical assistance to governments on national gender equality plans and strategies. She has over 20 years experience in this role, really looking at gender and development in international and non-governmental organizations. And she's also leading contributor and co-editor of the book Financing for Gender Equality, Realizing Women's Rights Through Gender Responsive Budgeting. It's my absolute pleasure and delight. I'm really interested in looking forward to this conversation. The Global Policy Advisor for UN Women, I really want to welcome Zohra Khan. Zohra, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Edna. It's a pleasure to be here today. And just at the outset, I would like to thank the Asian Business Leadership Forum for inviting me to participate. And of course, want to acknowledge His Highness, the Minister of Tolerance and Coexistence, His Highness Sheikh Nahyan Mubarak Al Nahyan, and also the Minister of Finance and Economy, His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuk.
And indeed, they have been tremendous supporters of ABLF. And again, you know, we're delighted that you've joined us now. We're looking, as we do many times, to, you know, at gender equalities around the world and just the importance really of, you know, inclusion for everybody. What impact do you think the COVID-induced financial distress that we've seen around the world really might have on gender parity?
I think that it's, you know, the evidence is very clear when it comes to gender equality and COVID. And we've seen across the world that women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, both as frontline healthcare workers. Almost 70% of the global healthcare workforce comprises women, but also as domestic workers, as care workers, and as those who predominate in some of the hardest hit sectors, such as tourism, services and retail. So that's one kind of cluster of issues. We've also seen, sadly, that with lockdown policies that governments have implemented across the world, that rates of domestic violence have skyrocketed. And UN Women calls this the silent pandemic, because it's a pandemic, you know, it's global, but that people don't talk about often. Some research that we've done also indicates that poverty levels amongst women have increased. We found that about 47 million women will be pushed into poverty by 2021. And this is really a dire situation, given all the work that had gone into the Millennium Development Goals and indeed the Sustainable Development Goals to tackle the scourge of poverty. The World Food Programme also finds that 270 million people will suffer from acute hunger by 2021, and we know that women are disproportionately impacted by shortages of food. In fact, women are 27% more likely to be impacted by acute hunger than men. And what's also quite scary, another massive COVID disruptor is around girls' education. So UNESCO estimates that about 11 million girls will never return to school. And this means that the risk of early and forced marriage will increase dramatically with this large number of girls outside of school.
I mean, these are just startling statistics. They really are. And one of the speakers we had on earlier, you know, our private equity, you know, entrepreneur from China, Wei Jinshan, you know, one of the things he really talked about was the absolute importance of education to bring people out of poverty. I mean, just, you know, for mere survival. He has an incredible story himself. But in girls' education, you're talking about 11 million girls that, I mean, that really we're looking at, you know, a gloomy future. I mean, it's just, it's staggering. And I think these figures too, you know, they must be personally upsetting. But when we look at these, you know, what can people do? What can we collectively do about this?
Well, I think there's a lot that governments can actually do. And UN Women has done some work around looking at what the global response, the global policy response is so far. And we've looked at something like 2,500 fiscal policy measures to assess where governments are, you know, what areas they're prioritizing, where they're putting their attention in terms of a policy response for COVID. And of the 2,500 measures, we found that about 992, which is a little less than 40%, have focused on VOW. Now that's understandable because violence against women is an incredibly important and difficult thing to tackle. So governments have responded very swiftly to address issues of violence against women across the world, and we're very pleased about that. But when you look at issues around social protection and issues around labor market policies, governments are doing less well. So we found that out of 1,300 economic measures that focus on social security, only 177 of those have any kind of gender sensitivity component. So when we talk about what we can do and building back societies that are inclusive, economies that are inclusive and so on, it's clear from the policy responsive governments that women and girls are being left behind. And the very startling statistic on education is worrying because over the past 20 years or so, a lot has been done to increase primary enrollment rates for girls. And now all of those gains are going to be eroded. In fact, we found that we are actually going back in terms of gender parity and gender equality, and about 25 to 30 years of progress that we've made, even though it's fragile, it's still progress. All of that is at stake of being lost just in 1 year.
And again, I mean, this is just, it's staggering statistics too. And it's a shame, when we look at that and the reality of it. I suppose when we look at, what are the big immediate priorities that governments are looking at, they're looking at health, they're looking at building back their economy. And as you say, sometimes, sadly, at the expense of all the great work that has been done. Let's have a look, and given the socio, cultural and the economic disparities, when we look around the region, and I know you take a global look, but when we look at the Asian region, and particularly when we look at developing countries, again, has that impacted the situation? Has it greater, or talk to me a little bit about that?
I mean, I think it very much depends on the composition and structure of the economy and where women are in the economy. So Asia, of course, as you know, is a very, very diverse continent. So you have very large, very advanced economies. And then you have economies that are, in developing stages. So it's very difficult to say that across Asia, this is the trend that we're seeing. But what we do know is that in Asia, of the roughly 613 measures that we have looked at at UN Women, about 206 of these have some element of gender sensitivity. Again, the majority of these are around violence against women, and much fewer around women's economic empowerment, and even fewer around the care economy. Now, these are important statistics because what has become very clear across the globe, whether you are in an advanced economy or a developing economy, is that care work, so the work that women do within the household, is really, buttressing the formal economy. Our societies and our economies are built on the backs of women's care work. So we have to be financing care services. We have to be financing, those things that women need in order to advance in the formal economy. And I think we're seeing where investments are made in care work, we're seeing at least better recovery, not ideal, but improved recovery. And I think that's incredibly important. Care work and financing of care services, in my view, is a blind spot right now. And I think governments really need to tackle that. Again, it's across the globe. It's the same trend that we're seeing emerge.
Yes, and I can totally understand what you're talking about. It almost is the work that goes on in the background and that people take for granted and nobody really formally recognizes. But of course, it must have that recognition, and it must, because anybody who is in an unpaid care position has been taken off the job market because they actually, cannot be out there. So it really is. You can just see that vicious cycle that it begins to create. But when we look at, really sort of sustainability in organized and even informal sectors, I suppose, like care work and that, the government, as you say, can take some steps. But also, I suppose, it is that combination of the public-private and really everybody getting involved, because it's an easy one to ignore, even though it's clearly, it shouldn't be ignored.
No, absolutely. I think the private sector has a critical role to play in supporting recovery efforts across the world, and we're already seeing that. We're seeing evidence of private actors coming in and supporting girls' education and so on. We're seeing the big role that philanthropy is playing in development of vaccines and in the pumping money into healthcare systems across the world and so on. So absolutely, the private sector has a big role to play, but that has to be buttressed by the right policies that government puts into place, because the private sector and government need to be working hand in glove in order to advance some of these policies. And I think sometimes it becomes very difficult if they're not working very, very closely together. So for sure, everyone has a role to play, but it has to be in a coordinated fashion in order to advance whatever the national gender equality objectives or indeed the national development objectives are. I think that's critically important.
Absolutely, because when we look at the wider population, it has to have everybody involved, and I think that's what's more important. You can't really leave anybody in, and particularly just to almost not break it in half, but it's to cut back in terms of the work that has to go into the gender equality. It really needs to be continued, and as you say, great work done. When we look at the Sustainable Development Goals and we see the work again that has already been done there, how do you see countries perhaps maybe redesigning and realigning their goals in terms of making sure that we see a more equitable future for men and women, and really that the population can advance together?
I don't think it's a question of redesigning the goals. The goals were agreed about 5 years ago, and it was through consensus. So it was all member states coming together at the UN and agreeing these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we all know that the goals really are a blueprint for both inclusive and sustainable development. And if applied well, I think the goals can really advance us towards recovery in this current context. So I wouldn't say it's about redesigning it, but certainly it creates a sense of greater urgency that we have to be acting on these goals. We've seen over the past 5 years quite mixed progress from governments around implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Some governments are, going at warp speed, whilst others are really struggling with domesticating the Sustainable Development Goals and creating the right policies, laws, incentives, and so on at country level to advance the SDG objectives. So I think what this pandemic really shows is the relevance of the goals and the urgency of the goals, and also the fact that the goals are really interconnected. You can't do one without the other. You can't talk about addressing the health pandemic without looking at the environmental goals. So it really is, as I said, a blueprint. It's about making sure that governments understand that these goals work together, and therefore policy needs to be designed with that in mind.
And indeed, I want to encourage all of our audience to actually, deliver some questions here. It's our last opportunity of the day. And this is an issue, of course, that many people, it's top of their mind, and a lot of people looking at this, wondering about it, and really, again, admiring the great work that's been done. Because obviously UN Women and all of your team, your supporters, the people who work with you, doing tremendous work in this space. I do have a question here that has come in. I have it on my box down here. Let me just have a look. Really, has there been any progress in governments effectively creating and implementing a gender-responsive budgeting scheme towards closing the gender gap? Is this something you see has been progressing?
So I love this question because this is my day job. So it's my preoccupation. And UN Women is just putting out a policy brief. It's going to be out in the next couple of days on precisely how governments are applying gender-responsive tools to COVID-19 support and recovery packages. And we're seeing some great examples around the world, both at state level and at national level, of governments actually, delving into gender impact assessments, doing things like gender budget statements, gender audits, and so on, and really, tackling the gender equality through the public finance management system. So looking at how, their fiscal policies address gender equality, but how they actually then allocate resources and track those resources through the PFM system. So there are several countries that have done really fantastic work in this regard. Much more needs to be done, of course, but we've seen, countries across the world that have really used GRB to increase resources for gender equality. But I must say what's incredibly important is, even before you talk about gender responsive budgeting, is making sure that countries have the fiscal space that they need. And especially for countries that have high debt burdens, it is incredibly difficult to create that fiscal space. So what we are working on now is helping countries, come up with kind of policy responses that allow them to have the adequate fiscal space to make the right investments for gender equality. And I think all the work that's being done around debt suspension and so on is critically important for this endeavor.
Indeed, because when we look, I think, at the debt burden of so many countries, and particularly developing countries, and indeed all countries in the world right now, I think we're looking at the debt that grows, because the immediate focus has been, to make sure that funds have been available. I mean, that's been number one thing in terms of, first of all, taking care of the healthcare and the crisis that's there in terms of, the pandemic that's around the world. But when you talk to governments and when you talk to policymakers, and they throw this argument, I suppose, in many ways, and say basically, there is not the money to do it, and unfortunately, there are more, what they would say, important things right now. Is this, you think, just kicking the can down the road? And it might be continued to kick down, or is there, is that the danger if actually they don't work hand in hand, almost in a parallel fashion, to make sure that there are gender priorities in there as well?
Yeah, I think it is a question of prioritization. We often talk about gender responsive budgeting as a political issue. And I think that if states are serious about advancing gender equality and not leaving, more than half of their populations in most countries behind, then you would need to be investing in gender equality and women's empowerment. We say it's the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do, and it really is. You can't talk about recovery from this pandemic without ensuring that gender equality is front and center of any policy response. So I do think it's important for countries to be thinking about this more as investments in future human capital rather than expenditures. And that's something we really try to push and advocate at UN Women. It shouldn't be, spend on gender equality shouldn't be seen as a burden or an expense. It actually has important future payoffs in terms of, women engaging much more in the economy and contributing to the economy. And Edna, I want to come back to the issue of care work. Without the work that women do at homes, we wouldn't, be able to talk about progress in our economies and in our societies and so on. So I think governments need to look at it from that perspective. Supporting or financing care work, social protection systems, healthcare and so on has to be a priority as we come out of this pandemic.
I think absolutely. There's so much. Now, I have some questions coming in here, tremendous interest from our audience here. And I know you've talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and a question that did come in from Alicia here. Do you think there is a need to maybe reorient and recalibrate any of the objectives that are mentioned in the SDGs as they stand right now? Do we need to add to them or shift or change perhaps?
I think what governments would have to do, and this is just inevitable, is prioritize. They would have to prioritize, and I think it's important for the audience to know that when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, these are global goals. So countries take these goals and apply them to the national context. So of course, there's some level of prioritization and alignment and realignment and so on at the national level. That will continue to happen, and I think that's incredibly important. But once again, we must make sure that the goal on gender equality is not lost. It really is a cross-cutting goal. It affects all the other 17 goals, and it's incredibly important for states to prioritize spend on gender equality.
Another question that's come in related to this a little bit too from Riaz: how are government institutions trying to find a balanced response to the pandemic as they take into consideration the significant impact on the crisis on gender and income equality and inequality, I mean, putting it together?
I'm not sure what a balanced response is, but I do think that it's incredibly tough for governments. I think there are, tough choices to be made, and they're difficult choices, but we're seeing some governments do, incredibly well and are trying to balance some of these. There are countries that are providing, very rapid cash transfers, putting in place very good social protection programs, responding to the health crisis very effectively. And I must say, in countries that are led, where we see there's a head of government or head of state who's a woman, we're seeing them steering quite exemplary responses to this crisis. And I think that's an important point to be, keeping in mind. They are communicating more compassionately, they are governing more transparently. So it really is about ensuring that, the governments give out the correct information at the right time, make the right investments. And it's difficult. It's very, these are tough choices that governments need to make.
Indeed, and I know you have some great initiatives within UN Women as well, and the He for She initiative that was put in place in 2014. I mean, that has got so much interest from around the world, and people actually, getting involved and actually making commitments and action. Can you talk to us just a little bit about initiatives like that that can actually help to make sure that, yes, it's awareness, but also that it's practical and tangible results that come out of this?
I mean, there are tons of things that UN Women is doing at the moment, and one of our primary preoccupations is around evidence and data. So it's just making sure that countries have what they need in order to respond to the kind of immediate impacts of this or results of this COVID pandemic. So, we've done a lot around putting out, policy briefs and putting out evidence and data across countries. And our gender policy tracker is just one such example around that. But we're also advocating for strong leadership around this, leadership that's underpinned by feminist principles of transparency and clear communication and so on, because we've seen, across the world where there's so much miscommunication about COVID, and miscommunication can lead to many things, such as, citizens and the population not understanding how to respond to this. So it's very, very important, and we at UN Women are very clear about how we want to be supporting governments around making sure that they have, again, the evidence and data that they need, but also that they're communicating about this pandemic in a transparent, clear way, so that people can make choices about behavior and so on. We also think that social cohesion is so critically important. We've seen in countries across the world where the pandemic is really dividing communities, and in making people really frustrated for all sorts of reasons. And we have to be communicating messages of social cohesion. So I think UN Women, as the UN system, is really honing in on the evidence and data piece, looking at issues around miscommunication, helping countries with the socioeconomic impacts, and understanding what needs to be done at the national level, and really just ensuring that countries have what they need to respond.
Yes, indeed, because as you say, it's about social cohesion. It's not a feminist issue. It's a human rights issue, really, and it's about making sure that everybody in the world, and that every government take a much more inclusive and fair role and fair action when we look at this in place. We have a few questions here, and from many people too. How can private organizations actually collaborate with UN Women in any way that can actually help to I sure raise awareness, but how can they actually get involved?
Well, we work with the private sector in all over the world, really, and we have a country office network that works directly on the ground in terms of service provision and all kinds of things. So there are many ways in which we work with the private sector. Of course, we do global work around advocacy and ensuring that we get the message out on gender equality and women's rights and the centrality and importance of that, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. So we do work with the private sector. There's many initiatives, and I urge people to go to our website unwomen.org to look at some of what those initiatives are, and they some of them are incredibly exciting. We also have the Women's Empowerment Principles, which are a set of principles that we advocate for private sector to comply with, because we think it's incredibly important to make sure that when we work with the private sector, that it's not just a question of, having this partnership, but making sure that the partnership actually works in a way that is respectful and that advances gender equality and women's rights. So the WEP principles, or the Women's Empowerment Principles, are really guiding our work around private sector engagement.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, there's quite a lot of questions on that area too, which is very encouraging too. And there was one in here from many people here, from Niaz Mohammed as well. But also what Niaz says, what are the measures that are taken by UN Women to make sure that women around the globe are given equality due to exploitation in some developing countries when it comes, to access to women's hygiene management, and in terms of just it's not all equally divided, and how can women make sure that they can have a strong day-to-day life and health and existence. There are still issues around this in many countries as well.
Absolutely, and I think the whole issue around wash, water, sanitation, hygiene for women is critically important. We work with our sister UN entities to advance this agenda and to ensure that women and girls have access to wash facilities. And I think that particularly in this pandemic, where hygiene and sanitation has become such an important and critical way to control outbreaks of this virus, that it becomes especially important. And for me, it's about governments making the right investments again. So what do they invest in terms of making sure that these facilities are available for all people, but especially for women, when issues around sanitation and hygiene are at the top of the agenda. So I absolutely agree with that. It's critical that this agenda is financed.
And indeed it is. I think when you look at the figures you gave us earlier, it's staggering. Questions around, has UN Women undertaken any specific partnerships recently in terms of advancing gender equality, particularly in the last year, in terms of how things have been throughout the crisis?
We absolutely, UN Women has been working with all actors around this pandemic, because of course we're part of the UN system. So with all our UN sister agencies, many of whom are doing direct service provision. The World Food Programme does work around food, and we have agencies that do work around commodities and so on. So it's critically important for us to ensure that these agencies have a gender dimension to their work. So I think that's one area. But working with all governments to ensure again that they have what they need to respond in an efficient, effective way. And we have been conducting rapid gender assessments with governments across the world to ensure that they have, again, this information that they need in order to design responses that are effective.
And indeed, as we look forward to the next year, are there any messages you want to be sending out there? What can people do collectively to make sure that we're all headed in the right direction?
I think listen to the advice of the health authorities. I think that's incredibly important. We're not out of the woods yet. It's clear across the world we're seeing second, third, surges in the infection rates. We're seeing countries implement more lockdown policies, which is absolutely important to get this pandemic under control. And I think, just heeding the words of authorities and making sure that you act safely is incredibly important, and also acting with compassion. I think if there's one thing that this pandemic has taught us, it's about our interdependence. It's about solidarity, and I think that's critically important for everyone to be aware of.
It's so true. It is. Thank you so much for bringing us on that journey, on a very rapid journey. There's so much more we could talk about, and I hope we will get the opportunity again, and certainly I hope we'll get the opportunity to see you in person at ABLF in the future. But lots of work, lots of challenges, but it's obviously in the right hands, and we say to you, keep up the good work. And once again, Zohra Khan from the UN Women, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Edna, for having me.
And